Hello, everyone. I'm Mack HAGOOD. It's a great honor to be invited to give this talk today. I only wish I could be there with you in person, in real time. I'd like to thank the conference committee and organizing team at Music Research Center, especially Kyung-Young Chung for the original invitation and Yi-Yun Chung for organizing everything so seamlessly. I hope we can continue to build a relationship in the future. Thank you for allowing me to deliver this paper via video recording due to unforeseen circumstances. I would be more than happy to respond to any questions, comments, and suggestions via email or Twitter. So today I'm going to talk about my research into tinnitus, which I've been conducting for over a decade now. Subjective tinnitus is the perception of ringing, humming, buzzing, or other so-called phantom sounds. In this talk, I'm going to claim that tinnitus has a lot to teach us about the politics of listening. Tinnitus sufferers are intimately familiar with not wanting to hear something, and with feeling that controlling one's own listening is essential to one's self-preservation. And I think that this is a common sensibility more generally today, at least in the United States, where I believe we are in a real crisis of listening. A crisis indicated by controversies around so-called filter bubbles, media echo chambers, campus safe spaces, disinformation, political tribalization, and so on. And my premise as a sound and media scholar is that we can learn a lot about listening in the informational and political senses by studying listening in the sensory sense. Because a similar behavior and even a similar physiology are at work when we recoil from a sound we don't like, such as tinnitus, and when we recoil from an idea we don't like. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about the relationship between tinnitus suffering and ideology. And then I'm going to move on to the neurophysiology of tinnitus. And then finally, I'll talk about how the interplay between ideology, ways of listening, and neurophysiology in tinnitus suffering can serve as a model of the politics of listening in contemporary neoliberal cultures. Now, before I get into it, I want to make a couple of quick disclaimers. I'll be making some ontological claims about tinnitus as a neurophysiological phenomenon, but that's obviously not the only way to think about it. Stephen Connor notes that the ancient Egyptians thought tinnitus came from a bewitched ear, and Inuit people consider it to be a harmless, hungry spirit. And in Western antiquity, tinnitus was considered an omen of some kind. So clearly, the meaning and political valences of tinnitus are culturally enacted, and I can't promise that all of my research into the current conjuncture of tinnitus in the United States will apply equally in the Republic of Korea. But I think some dynamics may be similar due to globalization and our similar economic and technological settings. So let me provide some background on my tinnitus research. It began with my dissertation in communication and culture at Indiana University, where I was doing ethnographic and archival research on a disparate set of sound technologies that all seemed to have something in common. There were so-called white noise machines, known as sound conditioners. There were nature recordings, such as the Environment series, and similar nature sound smartphone apps, which are extremely popular in app stores, and noise-canceling headphones. All of these technologies, it seemed to me, offered consumers the promise of controlling their perception of sound and thereby controlling their relationship to the sound they inhabit and controlling their own affect, achieving states of relaxation, focus, pleasure, etc. And it was this relationship between sound, space, self, and the social that I really wanted to learn about by studying these media that promise to serve as an interface between these different domains. So years later, in my book, Hush, Media and Sonic Self-Control, I would come to call these technologies Orphic media, after Orpheus. So in the tale of Jason and the Argonauts, the Argo encounters the Sirens, whose irresistible song captivates sailors' attention and leads them to certain death. However, Orpheus plays his lyre and sings his own counter song to protect the boat. And in fighting sound waves with sound waves, Orpheus prefigures today's Orphic media practices, masking or canceling unwanted sound in order to create a controlled environment and thereby control one's own attention and state of being. All right, so what does all of this have to do with tinnitus? Well, in my preliminary research, I learned that people with tinnitus were the most impassioned users of these technologies, as they used Orphic media to help distract themselves from the sound of their tinnitus and even to suppress the sound of their tinnitus through a mechanism that I'm going to describe in a bit. And this made sense. I mean, after all, who wants to get rid of unwanted sound and control their own attention more than a tinnitus sufferer? So in my research prospectus, I proposed to do an ethnographic study of tinnitus and media use. But then this project got very personal very suddenly, because one short week after my dissertation prospectus was approved by my committee, I was at a gas station filling up a bike tire with an air machine, and I overfilled the tire, and the tire ruptured right next to my left ear. And this sounded like a gunshot. It was really loud. People, 100 yards away were looking up, turning in my direction. They probably thought it was gunfire. I got dizzy. I started shaking. I started sweating. My ears were ringing with a tinnitus like I had never experienced before. Now, by the end of the day, many of those symptoms had gone away, but the tinnitus did not. So then I had to begin a year of fieldwork studying tinnitus, thinking about tinnitus every day, the one sound in the world that I would most have liked to forget about. I went to tinnitus clinics, support groups, and research centers. I went to hearing aid manufacturers and audiology conferences. I interviewed clinicians, neurophysiologists, and people with tinnitus. And all the while, I was dealing with my own anxiety, regret, and fear over the sometimes overwhelming sound that was now in my own head. And while I can't say that I would raise my hand and volunteer to relive that experience again, from the safety of the present, I can say that I'm happy it happened. Because as an ethnographer, I had an entirely new sensitivity to my interlocutors who were suffering from tinnitus. Elaine Scarry writes, "To have pain is to have certainty. To hear about pain is to have doubt. Neurologically, tinnitus is closely related to pain, and as in pain, the reality of tinnitus is always in doubt because no one else can hear it. My own tinnitus became a sometimes malevolent spirit guide through my fieldwork. Eventually, I learned a lot from accepting its presence and listening to it, noticing when it got louder, when it got softer, when it changed tone. Tinnitus taught me a lot about how hearing and listening work. I believe that tinnitus catalyzed these insights because of the clarifying power of fear. Fear not only heightens the stakes of tinnitus sufferers' Orphic media use, it also deepens their attention to their own hearing and practices of listening. And indeed, my own fear of tinnitus played an agentive role in the production of this research. The fear was so agentive, in fact, that I hesitate to call it my own fear. It really functioned more like an autonomous affect, making its own contributions in the field, whether I wanted those contributions or not. I learned in my interviews that certain dynamics emerge in every case where a person becomes a tinnitus sufferer as opposed to someone who merely experiences tinnitus. At some point in all of these cases, an affective fear emerges and attaches to the phantom sound. And once this happens, the tinnitus sufferer's audible world becomes akin to what sound scholar Steve Goodman calls an ecology of fear. A couple of things to know about tinnitus. First, its most common known cause is hearing damage, even very, very slight hearing damage from noise exposure. Second, because of a neurophysiological phenomenon called automatic gain control, tinnitus gets louder when a person's in a quiet space, and it gets quieter when a person is in a loud space. And when fear attaches to these processes, tinnitus sufferers realize that they inhabit and navigate a vibrational matrix of loud presences, which threaten to trigger future tinnitus, and quiet absences, which reveal the tinnitus that they have, which was just lurking in the background. As Hassana Sharp writes, summarizing Spinoza's concept of fearful affects, nature suddenly appears to be seething with signification. Everything and anything can seem to have a message of either hope or doom for the fearful. To my interlocutors, quotidian objects such as an empty room, a cup of coffee, a loud movie, or a vitamin became potential sonic threats that might trigger tinnitus, while a sound conditioner, a fan, a bird song, or hearing aid could offer the hope of relief. These individual social worlds were reconfigured by the fear of tinnitus and its effects on their own performance as they tried to live up to their responsibilities to others while being haunted by a sound that no one else could hear. And as I began my fieldwork, I too inhabited this ecology of fear. But in a profound way, the very process of theorizing tinnitus became part of my own recovery from suffering. Today, I still hear tinnitus, but I have a better relationship to it. I wouldn't call it a friend, but I do owe a lot to it. It's more like a wise but unfriendly professor whom I respect, but I don't really want to have dinner with. Or to be more accurate, I think I now recognize and acknowledge myself in the sound of my tinnitus. When I hear it, I'm hearing part of myself, a part that I had fearfully othered and rejected. So at this point, I want to talk about the relationship between tinnitus suffering and ideology. It might seem odd to claim that an audiological condition might be an ideological condition, but I'm going to claim that there are certain ideologies that encourage one to suffer from tinnitus rather than just experience tinnitus. And I'm going to begin with what Tobin Siebers calls the ideology of ability. In one of my very first interviews that I did with a tinnitus sufferer, I was confronted with a question that stopped me cold. I met Lara at a tinnitus support group meeting in a suburb of a large Midwestern city, 3 weeks after the morning that she had awoken to the sounds of whooshing and jingle bells. That's how she described her tinnitus. She'd spent the past weeks in a state of anxiety, asking herself questions familiar to all of us who had gathered that day in a public library meeting room. Why is this happening to me? Will I be like this forever? I did a follow-up phone interview with Lara, and she asked me another question that showed me just how poorly prepared I was for this research. Lara asks me, do you think tinnitus is a disability? Now, on hearing Lara's question, it dawned on me that I had never considered disability in conjunction to tinnitus, and in fact, I had no working definition of disability at all. I correctly foresaw a lot of additional reading in my future. So I kind of stumbled, I guess I haven't thought about it that way, but I guess if it disables you from doing certain things, then I guess it would be a disability. And Laura responded, it's a disability because it's occurring to us, happening to us. I would say it's a disability because a disability comes in where you're not yourself because this thing is happening to you. It's not the norm. It's not the usual occurrence for everyone every day. It was something that was thrust upon us. Now, as I began reading the disability studies literature, I quickly realized that Lara and I had implicit definitions of disability that were in opposition to those of disability theorists. Like most people, we conceived of disability as a bodily or mental flaw that disables you from doing certain things. Those were my words to Lara. Or something that is not the norm that makes you not yourself. Those were her words to me. Disability theory, on the other hand, considers disability to be not a physical or mental defect, but a cultural and minority identity. It takes as a given the diversity of human bodies and abilities, and it interrogates the ways that bodies are enabled and disabled by ideology, structures of power, and socio-material spaces and practices. Furthermore, disability theory acknowledges that all of us will be disabled at some point in our lives. This is the unacceptable truth that we try to ignore, that disability is normal, inevitable even. Tobin Siebers describes this aversion to reality as the ideology of ability, or a preference for able-bodiedness, one that sets the social standards for body, mind, and even human status itself. As seen in both my and Laura's reactions to tinnitus, the usual response to the disabled body is aversion and fear. The ideology of ability stands ready to attack any desire to know and accept the disabled body in its current state, Siebers writes. The more likely response to disability is to try to erase any signs of change, to wish to return the body magically to a past era of supposed perfection, to insist that the body has no value as human variation if it is not flawless. This reaction was evident in my own unhappiness that my research would force me to dwell on my tinnitus. It was also present in Lara's belief that she was no longer herself, no longer the same subject because of her tinnitus. She hoped to restore her body to an imagined former state of perfection, just as I was secretly grieving over my own imagined loss of perfection. In a very real sense, when Lara and I listened to our tinnitus as a fearsome signal of loss, we were hearing the ideology of ability. The way Lara and I perceived our own tinnitus was also strongly influenced by the liberal Western culture in which we had been raised, one in which the alleged autonomy of subjects is emphasized and naturalized. We are required to be free. As sound not chosen by the subjects who hear it, and in fact attached to the subjects who hear it, tinnitus is an affront to this liberal notion of selfhood as an ability and obligation to enact one's life in terms of choice. Such a self-concept emerges within political, economic, and social frameworks in which roles and identities are dictated not by tradition, but rather by a series of open-ended personal, professional, and consumer choices. And indeed, in my fieldwork, I saw tinnitus sufferers struggle to solve their lack of choice in hearing tinnitus by exercising consumer choice, buying electronic media such as iPods, sound machines, buying herbal supplements, special diets, and hearing aids, all using all of these things as technologies of the self, trying to shore up the self in order to restore the freedom of choice and restore control over their own subjectivity. Freedom of choice is an ideology closely related to the ideology of ability. These intertwined ideologies influenced not only the conscious sense that Lara and I made of our tinnitus, but also our phenomenological stance towards our tinnitus, our habitus of listening. Ethnomusicologist Judith Becker deploys habitus to better understand the differences between musical listening practices, such as those between the motionless and autonomous Western classical music audience member and the trancing Javanese gamelan participant. While the latter must necessarily surrender personal will and accept the penetration of her bodily boundaries by spirits, the former, as a bounded, rational, singular Cartesian self, allegedly, is unwilling and unable to trance in this way. The scholar who takes the Western listening self as a universal given, explains Becker, will never understand the dynamics of Javanese trancing. Turning Becker's habitus of listening to tinnitus, one can make a similar claim about Western subjects resisting phantom sounds perceived to violate bodily boundaries. My interlocutors with problematic tinnitus inhabit a way of listening informed by the idea that a natural self has the option of complete silence, unencumbered by sound. It feels unnatural to them that one should surrender one's personal will to penetration by an intruding signal. To experience tinnitus with such a habitus of listening is to listen to a loss of self and to think in terms of making the right choices in order to restore that self. But ironically, The action of monitoring tinnitus and trying to form meaningful connections between its fluctuations and one's personal choices actually perpetuates tinnitus awareness, anxiety, and volume, making tinnitus ever more present, ever more real. So, for example, if you heard about a pill that might take your tinnitus away, and you buy that pill and you swallow it, what are you going to do next? You're going to listen to your tinnitus to see if it got quieter or not. But that very act is raising your awareness of tinnitus and potentially increasing your suffering. And I met people who were doing things like this all day, every day. They were constantly shopping for cures, convinced that if they simply made the right choice, if they purchased the right thing, their tinnitus would go away. But this actually encouraged them to pay more attention to their tinnitus, because this form of listening is suffering. I observed Jill Meltzer, a doctor of audiology and the immediate past chair of the American Tinnitus Association, working with a patient in an office visit. She said to the patient, "The loudness of a person's tinnitus does not necessarily equate with how disturbing it is. You could be driven crazy by a tinnitus that's 2 decibels, and the person whose tinnitus is 9 or 12 decibels might say, it hardly bothers me." I like to compare it to a pebble in your shoe, she said. It doesn't have to be the biggest stone. It can be the smallest rock, and it can bug the crap out of you. In short, clinicians and researchers like Meltzer consider problematic tinnitus to be more a problem of listening rather than a problem of hearing. And as I'm going to detail in a moment, the prevailing model conceives of tinnitus in terms of emergent networks between the brain's so-called fear center and their auditory system. Similar linkages are found in conditions of hyperacusis, which is extreme sound sensitivity, and misophonia, in which particular sounds induce feelings of rage or panic, both of which are frequently comorbid with tinnitus. In each of these 3 conditions, the listener engages with her sonic environment in ways that emphasize maintaining autonomy from sound. Yet they are behavioral modules that actually hurt the listener. And these modes of listening as suffering are strongly encouraged by the ableist and individualist ideologies that I've discussed. Now, at this point, I should make explicitly clear that I'm not blaming individuals who suffer from tinnitus for inhabiting this form of listening. Indeed, to do so would be to fall prey to the illusion of individual autonomy that I am deploying tinnitus to dispel in this talk. We don't choose our neurophysiology, nor do we choose the ideological conditions that we're born into. I'm also not suggesting that only Western liberal subjects suffer from the sound of tinnitus. However, I am claiming that tinnitus is not a transhistorical phenomenological experience that is merely interpreted differently in different milieu. Instead, the meaning, suffering, treatment, and even the sound of tinnitus itself are enacted differently in differing cultural practices of listening and mediation. Okay, so as time went on in my research, I increasingly moved into a disability theory perspective that radically challenged the notion that tinnitus was something separate from me that wasn't supposed to be there. I also studied the neurophysiology of tinnitus to see what I could learn from it about human listening. This fascinating model eventually became a centerpiece to my thinking about the politics of listening, although some of its lessons are rather grim, I'm afraid. So let's dig into the neurophysiological model. Researchers explain tinnitus this way. In silence, the neurons in the auditory system fire randomly. In tinnitus, we perceive this normal, random neuronal firing as sound. Now, why does this happen? Well, one of the fundamental axioms of the neurophysiological model is that the auditory system is homeostatic. It regulates itself in relation to the sonic environment. As the creator of the model, Pavel Yastrebov, told me, The auditory system needs sound like the body needs food. When it is deprived of sound, hearing becomes more acute. There's a strong relationship between tinnitus and a reduced auditory input, comparable to a sound engineer turning up the volume on a weak signal and thus amplifying the mixing board's inherent noise. Due to this automatic gain control, most people will experience tinnitus in the dead silence of an anechoic chamber. So most tinnitus stems from hearing loss, but sometimes it's very small amounts of hearing loss that are barely measurable. When the auditory system experiences this deficit, it compensates by turning up the volume, similar to how the eye dilates in low light. This greater sensitivity increases the chance of perceiving the random firing of auditory neurons as sound. But still, as self-generated noise or randomness, tinnitus is the opposite of a useful signal. I mean, this is random firing that is supposed to indicate silence. So why do we perceive it as sound at all? And then why does it become such an overwhelming perception for some, but not others? Well, to put it simply, sometimes people experience a failure of filtration. So this is the neurophysiological model of tinnitus. The vast majority of sounds that enter our ears and our auditory nerves, aka the auditory periphery, the vast majority of those sounds get filtered out by our auditory subconscious. So these sounds never make it to the cerebral cortex where they would, be consciously evaluated. Well, the same is true for this random firing of neurons. Most people don't hear tinnitus unless they're in a really sound-deprived space. And even then, if a person notices the sound and they don't find it important or worth noticing, the sound will be filtered out again by the auditory subconscious. Suffering from tinnitus, hyperacusis, and misophonia arises when neurons organize in such a way that the perception of sound in the auditory pathways is linked to the limbic system. This is the brain's so-called fear or emotion center, and the autonomic nervous system, which controls things like heart rate, perspiration, and breathing. So once these connections are made, they have a tendency to strengthen in a vicious circle, as the perception that tinnitus is an oral threat encourages the auditory system to turn up the volume, further increasing tinnitus and sound sensitivity. So one's cognition about tinnitus and a fight or flight reaction can literally make the tinnitus louder in one's head. This is what happened to me when the bike tire ruptured and I flew into a state of panic and I was sweating and all of those symptoms, right? So I want to contrast that experience with a different kind of experience that many of us have had. So you attend a loud concert. Your auditory system is affected by the powerful sonic force of the PA system, causing what's called temporary threshold shift. This is an immediate reduction in your ability to hear. And it's done to actually protect your auditory system. It basically turns down the sensitivity of your auditory system. So, after you leave a concert, automatic gain control attempts to compensate for that reduced ability to hear, producing that familiar ringing in your ears. So in a Spinozan sense, tinnitus is an affective result of the body's reduced capacity to act. And yet this tinnitus, which is probably just going to go away in time, it may not bother you at all. In fact, you might even joke about it or brag about it. You might take it as a sign of a night well spent, right? So how exactly does it come to bother some people so terribly? Well, this is where a combination of neurophysiology and classical conditioning comes into play. Yastrebov's model treats tinnitus as a stimulus and suffering as a conditioned reflex. So that's this reflex is enacted through neural networking. Yastrebov classifies three general categories of sound: neutral sounds, which we don't find significant; positive sounds that have some kind of positive meaning or pleasant nature to us, and then those sounds that have a negative or unpleasant association or meaning. With every new sound, the limbic and autonomic nervous systems are slightly activated. This results in what's called an orientation reaction. It's when we turn our head to look in the direction of the sound. We want to learn more about the sound we just heard, right? Meanwhile, our autonomic nervous system is preparing our body for an appropriate reaction should that reaction be needed. In the case of a happy concert goer leaving the venue with friends after a euphoric evening, this new sound of tinnitus is likely to be perceived as insignificant, or it might even take on a positive meaning. In this case, the connections between activity in the auditory periphery and the limbic and autonomic nervous system, well, all of those connections just fall away. They weaken, and the auditory subconscious filters the sound out. This filtering is called a habituation of perception, and it allows us to ignore most of the sounds that we experience in our everyday life so that we can concentrate on sounds we perceive to be important. In the case of the tinnitus sufferer, however, a negative association attaches to tinnital sound, and the network with the limbic system forms, creating a sense of fear or annoyance, and then this reflexive fight or flight response in the autonomic nervous system. The sound perception immediately gets shuttled to conscious mind, to the frontal cortex for evaluation, and then thinking comes into play. And if these are fearful thoughts like, oh my God, what is that? Is this ever going to go away? Am I going to go crazy? Then this further increases limbic and autonomic nervous activity. And then once those neural connections get made as a conditioned reflex, it's just a real vicious circle. The auditory system turns up the volume even louder because it thinks it's helping you by helping you hear a threat. So this is a feedback loop of suffering as a conditioned reflex, and they're very hard to overcome. Jastreboff compares ignoring tinnitus in such a case to trying to hold a conversation in the presence of an untethered wild animal. Our attention is just going to get drawn to the animal, and it becomes impossible to carry on a conversation. So just a conscious attempt to control this is not going to be successful. What clinicians have to do is they use methods such as tinnitus retraining therapy to treat these conditioned reflexes by actually changing their patients' listening. Now, amazingly, their tools are very similar to the orphic media that patients use intuitively, but these clinicians use the tools differently. While patients typically try to drown out their tinnitus entirely, TRT clinicians use white noise to suppress the tinnitus level to a point where patients can still hear their tinnitus, but it feels less overwhelming. Then, they do counseling to help patients change their thinking about listening and help them to accept the tinnitus signal instead of trying to get rid of it, and eventually to change their actual listening practices, breaking this conditioned reflex and the linkages between the limbic and auditory system in order to create habituation. And eventually, patients can go for long periods of time without thinking about or even hearing their tinnitus. Okay, so Jastreboff's model presents the auditory system as a homeostatic interface with the vibrational world, operating faster than the speed of thought. What are its lessons for understanding the politics of listening? Well, here are some implications. Number one, filtration or tuning out inputs is essential to hearing and consciousness. The auditory system is hungry for sound, but it also filters out sound at the same time. Reaching out and blocking out, sociality and autonomy, both are essential. Second, despite common rhetoric about how sound penetrates, invades, and unites individuals, there's something very solipsistic about the auditory system, which simply wants to maintain equilibrium. Third, equilibrium is not the same as happiness. As seen in tinnitus and similar disorders, a homeostasis achieved at a lower level of the organism through a preconscious mode of listening may be dysfunctional at a higher conscious level. Fourth, irrational or dysfunctional modes of listening can be imprinted on the system as conditioned reflexes. Fifth, conditioned reflexes of listening can only be undone by changing practices of listening, not simply through ideological critique. That said, number 6, practices of listening exist in interplay with reflexive ideas about listening. This is the interface between ideology and conditioned reflexes, and this is the hopeful space where we can change listening. Now, however distasteful all of this talk about conditioning might be for some humanities scholars, the science behind it is really well established, and I do think that science and the humanities need one another. Science assumes the existence of subjectively pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral sounds without an adequate theory for how these categorizations are enacted in ideological discourse. I think there's a synthesis to be had between affect theory in the humanities and neurophysiology, one that can better account for all of the dimensions that enact oral suffering, from the molecular all the way up through the discursive. Such an approach allows us to zero in on how, in specific cultural contexts, affects attach to neutral sound stimuli and become conditioned reflexes. Sometimes this happens through trauma. I found this to be the case with many tinnitus sufferers who, like me, had an illness, surgery, or other traumatic event associated with their tinnitus suffering. As a volunteer doing tinnitus support work, I met one man who lived in the woods, and he loved these woods very, very much. Sadly, he had to cut down all of the trees in his woods because of an invasive beetle. After the chainsaws ceased their whine, he was left alone in the silence, without the familiar sounds of birds or wind in the trees. And that's when he heard the sound of his tinnitus, and he became convinced that something was medically wrong with him. My hunch was that his trauma, loss, and the silence all amplified and problematized a tinnitus that was always there. In a very real way, an entire material history of globalization and eco-disaster were resounding in his ears, whether he heard it that way or not. Sometimes political, sonic, and neurological dimensions collide in horrific and dramatic ways. One of the most common manifestations of post-traumatic stress disorder in war veterans is panic induced by loud sounds. As Martin Daughtry puts it, the sounds of war live on as a ghostly resonance, haunting those who have been exposed to the toxic nexus of sound and violence. Ideology can prime us for and exacerbate these traumatic experiences of sound. As I've shown, my tinnitus was exacerbated by liberal and ableist ideologies. The suffering of Daughtry's male soldiers was exacerbated by shame and anger, as masculinist ideologies told them that they should not respond to loud sounds with panic. But ideological listening can become reflexive in less dramatic ways. Specific affects can gradually attach to neutral sound stimuli, accumulating in embodied habits of listening. Within a recent 3-part series called Voices on my Sound Studies podcast, Phantom Power, sound scholar Stacy Copeland shared her research into how professional women radio broadcasters heard the sounds of their own voices. "It's like nails on a chalkboard," one of them said. "I guess I'm biased against myself." These broadcasters were highly aware of the sexist nature of their industry and its listening practices around gender. However, they had to consciously and repeatedly inhabit a patriarchal auditory perspective for professional purposes. And worse yet, they also found themselves listening this way automatically, responding negatively to the sound of women's voices in a knee-jerk fashion. As Stacy notes in the podcast, critique doesn't prevent even us scholars from inhabiting this kind of automatic listening. Instead, we find ourselves flipping back and forth between critical and ideological listening. So what are the implications of this for ideological critique? Well, I'm a big fan of Jennifer Stover's book, The Sonic Color Line. In it, she theorizes what she calls the listening ear, the ideological filter shaped in relation to the sonic color line, a historical aggregate of normative American listening practices that gives name to listening's epistemological function as a modality of racial discernment. That was a quote. Stover's book examines what she calls, quote, willful white mishearings and auditory imaginings of blackness, end quote. Those are legion, to be sure, right? But here's my question. What if some of these mishearings are not willful, but reflexive? What if racist epistemologies become racist ontologies in the conditioned reflex? Stover's opening example in her book is Michael Dunn's 2012 murder of Jordan Davis for playing hip-hop too loud in a gas station. I'm disturbed and disgusted that a white man felt entitled to enforce his sonic sensibility in a public space by murdering a black youth. But I'm terrified by the prospect that Dunn committed this act because racist ideological indoctrination primed linkages between hip-hop, Dunn's auditory system, and his amygdala, creating an actor network of sorts, a network completed by the gun that Dunn, like too many other Americans, carried on his person. An affect of fear, ideologically attached to the stimulus of black sound as a preconscious, conditioned reflex, I find that to be an extremely disturbing prospect, not only because of its knee-jerk nature, but also because, as we've seen, critique is no cure for a conditioned reflex. You can't fix these politics of listening simply by supplying healthier political ideas, especially when the subject is affectively invested in homeostatically remaining the person they think they are. And doesn't this describe the politics of the internet, where ideology proves impervious to journalistic fact-checking, and individual and in-group affective investments supersede any construction of a shared truth at a national political level? I want to just real quick sort of conclude here by mentioning how studying tinnitus and the neurophysiological model has shaped my understanding of media as a media scholar. In Hush, I frame media as affective rather than informational. To put perhaps too fine a point on it, information is just a tool we use to manage our feelings. The current crisis of listening arises in part from not understanding the solipsistic, affective nature of our media technologies. That in fact, they are not simply communication technologies, but like the auditory system itself, they are technologies of listening and not listening, interfaces that allow us to filter out as much as they allow us to hear. Media allow users to offload some of the burden that falls on our neurological filtration systems in a neoliberal, information-saturated milieu. Unfortunately, as we use media to engage the world in this way, many of our motivating feelings and beliefs about what empowers and disempowers us are what Spinoza called inadequate ideas, short-sighted, incomplete, and inaccurate. And that's why we so often use media in ways that hurt others and hurt ourselves. In the case of tinnitus, my own inadequate ideas, my ableist and individualist ideologies, were generative of listening practices that othered the sound of tinnitus, enacting listening as suffering in a conditioned reflex. Like most people with tinnitus, the more I used earplugs and tried to protect my hearing, the worse my tinnitus got. I needed to learn to listen to tinnitus as part of myself and to stop listening to the world as a threat. I needed to give up control of my listening to find relief. And that in itself was a scary process, that letting go. Patients who want Orphic media to control tinnitus, they tend to continue suffering. But those who use Orphic media to help them relinquish control and listen more adventurously, they tend to have good outcomes. Similarly, subjects today are being culturally conditioned to find sound and other people's voices to be intolerable. Media design typically frames listening in the ideological terms of ability and choice choice to control our equilibrium, sonically, affectively, socially, politically. The marketplace offers us bespoke material comforts of control, noise-canceling headphones, custom noise feeds, music streams designed for utilitarian optimization rather than intercultural and interpersonal participation. Individualized products and media content help us feel enabled and secure in alienated, anti-communitarian social environments. But they also make subjects feel even more sensitized to difference, exacerbating and commodifying instinctive habits and tendencies towards fight or flight. But as the case study of tinnitus shows, we can create critical listening practices that challenge inadequate ideas and break conditioned reflexes. Unfortunately, there's no easy answer to our widespread cultural hyperacusis and misophonia. Reflexive hate, trolling, racism, sexism, transphobia, and so on, these things are real. And the people on the receiving end of these things have to have a filtration system as a form of self-care. Resilience is a rightfully controversial word in a neoliberal economy that often deploys resilience in order to legitimate and perpetuate its own abusive nature. See Robin James on this subject. But as I hope I have demonstrated, defensive listening, listening as control, can be its own kind of agony. So for me, the question is, how do we invent sonic technologies for freedom beyond control? And that's my talk. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks so much for the invitation. If you have any questions or comments, suggestions, please get in touch. And also, please consider checking out my podcast, Phantom Power. You can find it and subscribe at phantompod.org. We have a new episode this month with sound scholar Jonathan Stern. I think that you might enjoy that. So this